Hi, I'm Nastasia Bach. I am here today on behalf of Pivot Regulatory. We are a Munich-based consultancy specialized in political strategy in the healthcare and consumer protection sector. So whether you work in Germany or not, I'm sure we can all agree that it's a very complicated process in Germany, so I hope to shed some light on that in the first part of the presentation. And the second part of the presentation will focus on the tender and answer the question, why might Germany be reliant on imports, and it does not just merely have to do with the quantity. So, how did Germany get there? Okay. Sorry. So like in many other countries, and I know like in Canada, the main impetus for regulatory change was a series of court decisions. So after the 2005 Federal Administrative Court decision, which ruled that patients should have access to medical cannabis, the Federal Opium Agency started issuing special exemptions for patients to access and possess medical cannabis. Now, about 1,000 of these exemptions were issued, but patients had to bear the cost of treatment themselves. And at that time, medical cannabis cost around 12 euros a gram, which for some is unaffordable, or was. So then in 2016, the same court ruled that seriously ill patients should be able to grow their own cannabis for medical purposes. Now, this decision was extremely controversial in Germany. The reason is because the German healthcare system does not foresee patients medicating themselves in the case of serious illnesses. So that decision is really what made politicians act, and as a result, the Cannabis as Medicines Act was passed in March 2017 of last year. So the Cannabis as Medicines Act, which you might find interesting compared to the ACMPR in Canada, which preceded the Cannabis Act. The law in Germany is only 3 pages, whereas yours is around 114. So it is rather short, but it does regulate 2 main things. The first is the right of a patient, first is a patient's right to care and reimbursement, and the second is production. So in order for a patient to be able to access medical cannabis, there are 3 legal criteria which have to be met. First, the patient has to be seriously ill. Second, there has to be an absence of an alternative therapy. And third, there needs to be a reasonable prospect of success. There is no definition of serious illness in the Cannabis as Medicines Act. That is left to the doctor. So the second aspect of regulation is production. Now, again, in comparison to Canada, which where the act, your Cannabis Act, regulates commercial production in great detail, in Germany, the regulation of production is merely a framework, and the guiding framework for that is the UN Single Convention on Narcotics. So much of the implementation of the law is actually left to the government, or in other words, the BfArM. So what I'd like you to take from this slide is that the implementation of production is left to the BfArM. So how does it actually work in practice? Now, before a doctor gives a patient a statutory health insurance prescription, the patient has to receive reimbursement from their statutory health insurance. In the meantime, a doctor can issue a, what they call in Germany, a privates Rezept, so that the patient does have access to cannabis in the meantime. So the doctor fills out a form which consists of around 10 to 12 questions. The purpose of the form is to ensure that the 3 legal criteria have been met. The form then goes to the statutory health insurance, and in, I'd say, 95% of the cases, the statutory health insurance passes on the application to the MDK. The MDK is the Medizinischer Dienst der Krankenkasse. And their role is to consult the statutory health insurance and provide ad hoc assessments. Now, the MDK usually takes about 3 to 5 weeks to reach a decision. As you can see, it's a fairly large time span. In the case of palliative patients, they have to make a decision within 3 days. So the MDK approval rate countrywide is on average about 64%, which means 1/3 of the patients in Germany do not receive reimbursement. Now, this approval rate actually varies according to each federal state. The range is between 40 to 75%, which is very big. What that large range also might suggest is that patients in different federal states face different accessibility hurdles. So, if the patient does not receive reimbursement, the patient may launch an appeal within 1 month of the decision, or in the alternative, the doctor can give them a private prescription. A private prescription basically means that the patient has to cover the costs of their medical treatment themselves. Now, in Germany, medical cannabis is extremely expensive in comparison to others. It costs 24 euros a gram. If a patient is prescribed 3 grams a day, this could mean monthly costs of up to about 2,000 euros. So, this might give patients an incentive to opt for cheaper alternatives, and there are reports in the media of patients actually being caught with their own cannabis plants. So once the patient has the prescription, they go to the pharmacy. The pharmacy plays a very important role in this whole process, and that's because medical cannabis in Germany is qualified as a magistral preparation, which means that the pharmacy has a special role in quality assurance. So the pharmacy has to carry out a number of things, the main one being they have to check the identity of the cannabis flowers. They have to, in fact, check the identity of each individual container in which the cannabis is delivered. They have to document the process. They have to price it, and they also have to repackage it. So medical cannabis in Germany cannot, or is not meant to, be dispensed in the producer's container. So what I'd like you to take away from this slide is that the process is fairly long, and there are various varying approval rates for reimbursement, and that there might perhaps be incentives for patients to acquire their medical cannabis elsewhere because of the high cost of cannabis. Now, the question is, why is cannabis so expensive in Germany? Here is a breakdown of the costs. So, as I mentioned, cannabis is legally qualified as a magistral preparation, which means that the pricing is subject to the Arzneimittelpreisverordnung. If the pharmacy processes the cannabis, grinds it, and creates individual dosages, then the pricing is subject to paragraph 5. and there is a 90% fixed surcharge, including a few other surcharges. If the pharmacy receives a prescription for unprocessed cannabis, then there is a 100% surcharge. So just to give you a brief overview, the pharmacy, what they call Apotheker-Einkaufspreis, pharmacy purchasing price, is about 10 euros, and then it's dispensed to the patient and costs 24 euros. So I've spoken to you now about the regulation of cannabis in Germany and patient access. And the next thing I'd like to talk to you about is the tender, which is probably one of the more controversial aspects right now. So, the regulation of domestic supply. Now, there are three aspects of the tender I'd like to talk to you about. The first is the product tendered, the second is the strains tendered, and the third is the quantity. So, with regard to the product tendered, the only product tendered in Germany is dried cannabis. Now, in practice, doctors actually like prescribing a range of forms of cannabis, such as capsules or extracts. And as you can see from this graph, about 50%, 40 to 50% of the prescriptions in Germany are dried cannabis flowers. Now onto the strains tendered. So in Germany, there are 3 types of strains tendered. Each of the types has a THC corridor, a THC range of about 4%, and type 3 has also a CBD range of about 4%. Now I'd like you to think of these types as corridors, and if you look to the right of the chart, this represents the strains that doctors in Germany can prescribe, and about a third of these strains do not fit in either of the 3 corridors. If these really are the strains that doctors in Germany prescribe their patients, then it might suggest that Germany will have to rely on imports to bring them onto the market. Now onto the quantity. We have asked the Institute for Political Evaluation in Frankfurt to create a forecast on the consumption. I would just like to make it very clear, this is not an accurate forecast. It is not an accurate forecast, and the reason being because we don't know enough in Germany about some key factors, which I'm going to speak to you about. And we are actually going to conduct surveys to find out about more of the prescription practices of doctors. But the aim of this graph is primarily to show you that there are 2 drivers of consumption in Germany. The first one is the patient rate increase, and the second one is the distribution of patients across daily dosages. So what these 3 forecasts demonstrate, the lowest line is the most conservative forecast, and the presumption is that the maximum daily dosage is 1 gram. The middle line is the less conservative forecast, and the presumption is that the maximum daily dosage is 2 grams. The upper line is the least conservative forecast, and the presumption is also that the maximum daily dosage is 2 grams, but that over time, patients are prescribed more. Now, what all of these 3 lines do take into account is an increasing number of patients. Now, this is in sharp contrast to the government's assumption, which is that the market is static, which you can see by the line. So in Germany, 2.6 tons of cannabis are tendered over the space of 4 years to a total of 10,4 tons. And producers have the option to increase their quantity produced by 10%. But as I mentioned, this is not accurate. We're going to try and conduct surveys to find out more information and to make this as accurate as possible. But what I really do want you to take away from this is that the German government does not take the two main driving forces of consumption in Germany into account. Now, can it be done differently? So we have drawn a comparison with 2 other EU tenders, and we have used 3 points of comparison. One is adherence to the UN model. The other is the optimization of patient care, and the third aspect is the administrative nature of the procedure. Now, as you can see, the Netherlands adheres most to the UN model. I think Germany would like to as well, but actually the BfArM does not take the medical cannabis into physical possession like in the Netherlands, rather it takes it into actual possession. In Denmark, the cannabis agency does not do that. Now on to the optimization of patient care. In Denmark, there is no limit to the products tendered. So producers can apply to produce a product, an extract or a capsule, and once the product is approved, it's admitted to a list so that patients know that the medicine they are being prescribed is government approved. Now, in Denmark, there is no limit on the quantity of cannabis produced, and there's also no limit on the number of producers like in Germany. In Germany, there will be a minimum of 3 producers and a maximum of 13 producers. And in the Netherlands, Bedrocan has a monopoly, so the tender is structured as such to give the producer a monopoly, although I believe that this year they have opened a new tender. So now with regard to the administrative nature of the procedure, Denmark actually assesses applications on a rolling basis, and their pilot program, which was launched in January of 2018, is, I'd like to say, potentially more efficient in the sense that within the space of a year, producers are already going to be able to get their first harvest. Whereas in Germany, as you know, it's we're probably only going to have, if everything goes accordingly, the first harvest in 2020. So here's a summary of the key points I've discussed. The aim of the Cannabis Act was to primarily to improve patient care, but to prevent patients from home growing. The Cannabis as Medicines Act leaves a lot of the implementation of production to the government. And in practice, the process of accessing medical cannabis is rather long, it's rather complicated, and depending on which federal state you are in as a patient, you have probably different levels of accessibility. So the fourth point is that if Germany really wants to optimize patient care, the country is very likely to be reliant on imports because of the restriction on the product, the types of strains, and the quantity produced. And when drawing a comparison with other EU tenders, the case of Denmark demonstrates that it can actually be done differently. So, does anyone have any questions?